Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next edition of Real Talk at the Barbershop, the virtual edition. I love it. I hope everybody's doing good. I'm Tony Waller, make you want to scream and holla up in here, and we're getting ready to have our next wonderful conversation. I'm so excited. As you all know, we've been doing these conversations around different pillars that we as Walmart are planning to focus on as we try to figure out what are the roles that we can play in making a difference in racial inequity and racial equity in this country. So today I want to take one of those pillars, and the pillar is going to be education. And I have two amazing people here with me today, people who I admire, who are just wonderful thought leaders, and I'm hoping that the conversation will leave us with some really wonderful things and interesting things to be thinking about as we move forward in this era in the world of education. Sounds good? Sounds good. Let's get this thing rolling. First, let me introduce you to my two wonderful friends. I'd first like to introduce you to Miss Sharhonda Bossier. Sharhonda Bossier is Deputy Director of Education at Education Leaders of Color. Welcome.
Thank you.
How are you, Sharhonda?
I'm well. I'm excited for this conversation. It's been a while since I've seen both of your faces, so I'm looking forward to this.
Me too. And then I'd also like to bring to everyone's attention the incomparable Mr. David Johns, Executive Director of the National Black Justice Coalition. However, his that's just a piece of what he does. He is a true educator at heart and has been involved in this education space for a very, very long time. And so he's going to definitely bring some wonderful insights to the conversation as well. Welcome, David.
No pressure. No pressure. Thank you, Tony.
How are you?
I am vacillating between Solange's Weary and Beyonce's Freedom.
Ooh, oh my goodness. Now, isn't that something to talk about in the barbershop? Mm-hmm. Love it. So let's just start with this. Let's just start with this. Give me your thoughts on the state of education today. Like, let's just start with the basics, right?
Just that.
I know it's huge, y'all. I know.
That's basics?
Go ahead, leader.
Oh my goodness. I think one of the, when I think about this a lot, because this is a question I get a lot, we have just become so unimaginative as a country, right? I think there are ways that we should be thinking about what public education looks like, ways that we should be reimagining the schooling experience for young people. And we just have been stuck in the same models, producing the same outcomes for so long. And it seems we lack both the imagination and the political will to change, right? And so, I think what COVID and what the last, 4 months has really highlighted for me is this sense that we consistently say that we don't have the resources to get things done, right? Well, we could give every kid, a laptop, but we don't have the resources for that. We could pay for young people to go to college for free, but we don't have the resources for that. And I think what we saw was actually in a state of emergency, we could find the resources, right? And so the question for me, and one that I've been grappling with, is where and how do we build the political will to not need an emergency to spark that kind of quick, fast innovation that we know is actually going to change the face of public education in this country, right? And on the other side of this, I hope that schools look very different. I hope that we are thinking about what individualized instruction can and should look like. I hope we are thinking differently about how we tend to the social and emotional needs of our young people. I hope we are thinking differently about the roles that schools should play in broader communities as anchor institutions.
I agree. That's her Instagram I would double tap, as I do often. Sharhonda is a colleague and a dear friend as well, and I agree with everything she said. And I will begin where she ended, which is to acknowledge two things. One, Brian Stevenson said some time ago that the system works exactly as designed. And we should all be clear about that, right? I take a lot of my cues from Black women. The world doesn't deserve them generally. But Gloria Lansing-Billings, who is an education researcher at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, gave a talk at Columbia University Teachers College shortly after Katrina, a recent disaster that sometimes we forget happened. And the point of her talk and the title of her talk was, "And Now They Are Wet." And the point she made, which I think is relevant now, given COVID, given the current social crises connected to the acknowledgement of Black lives mattering and the necessary shifts in practice to honor that, not only in slogan, but also in practice and in principle, is that the same is true for our children, those communities that Sharhonda named, and I would also name and add students who are sexual minorities, students who are trans, queer, non-binary, or otherwise show up in ways that are not heterosexual, heteronormative, or the ways in which we are expected to perform both gender and sexual identity in schools. And the point that I'm trying to make here, again, is that the schools have not worked for students who are not white, not able-bodied, not rich, not able to buy their way into the few schools that do work for quite some time. The thing that I'm most excited about in this moment of disruption is the ability to do what Sharhonda named and what Octavia Butler and so many others, and Janelle Monáe invite us to do, which is to dream. And dream what heretofore I have referred to as radical dreams. I'm much more mindful of the way in which the right uses radical to suggest that it's so fantastical that it'll never happen. And so I find myself saying more now often necessary changes, but all of them should center the well-being of our babies. The last thing I'll say, to your point, Tony, about things that are not even being discussed, because there are so many things to discuss, right? Even just today, I've moved through all that has happened in this administration, the importance of people being counted as in relation to the census, the importance of people being safe if they are frontline workers, which many members of our communities often are, and the like, is also appreciating that so many of our babies are not well. What we know is that prior to COVID, the mental health of Black students in particular was on the decline. And by that, I mean, there's data. We submitted a report to Congress, to CBC last December, that showed that the suicide rates for youth have been decreasing for all communities of children, with the exception of Black children. And so the point that I'm making is that we know anecdotally that so many members of our community are not well. I think, again, about the teachings of Dr. Joy DeGruy, post-traumatic slave syndrome. We don't even talk about the fact that for generations, we Black people have sent our kids to schools that we acknowledge don't support positive learning and development or identity development. And at a minimum, we accept that they're going to be exposed to racial trauma.
I love it. I could not agree with you more. And the thing that probably you were talking about, things that kind of we wrestle with in our minds. I've been wrestling with this thought about how all of these inequities in education are having are creating deeper challenges for the workforce than we haven't even thought about, right? Let alone, obviously, you want a well-educated workforce. You want to get people ready to compete for opportunities. That's kind of like the obvious, right? But I also look at how it's impacting the workforce today. When I think about parents who are trying to figure out how to do the best that they can for their children and how they have to make a decision on whether or not to go to work or not, right? That is a workforce issue. Parents shouldn't have to deal with those kinds of things.
Again, Black feminist and a lot of Patricia Hill Collins and teachings around intersectionality and the related work around critical race theory. So Derek Bell, Kimberly Crenshaw, Delgado, that crew, have helped me to appreciate that often we have conversations that suggest that the institutions that make our society function exist in silos. And that is to say that education is separate from our healthcare system, and that's separate from our system of policing and the criminal industrial complex. And the reality is that not only is that not true, they are very much interrelated, but they are all affected by the things that exist in society. And so I want to be clear that too often we as adults think that like the walls that learning happens within in traditional contexts, like the schools that we send babies to, are impervious to the things that affect us in society. And the reality is that they are not, right? And so one of the things that I think is missed in all of this is that like the conversations that are compelling people to risk their lives to go protest in the streets, to respond to the need for radically inclusive and necessary racial, social, economic, political justice also affects the experiences that our students have in schools, their ability to demonstrate what they know and have learned, and then to be able to make critical connections to workforce opportunities that exist outside of school. And so I want to be clear, because too often people gloss over this, especially the teaching workforce, which is disproportionately comprised in the K-12 space of mostly white women who are often agents of perpetuating, legitimizing, and making invisible the ways that white supremacy and anti-Blackness work. But unless and until the workforce, teachers and leaders, system leaders, education entrepreneurs, which tend to be a more diverse group compared to that group of white women classroom teachers, unless and until they dig into being not just not racist, but being anti-racist, and doing the work to overcome the challenges of not being competent with regard to diversity more generally, or with regard to sexual identity, gender orientation or expression more specifically, we will continue to come back to this problem. The second thing that I think we miss often now is that, yes, for so many people, for too many people, school is thought of as a form of babysitting. We don't think often enough about it as a place where children at birth, right? Remember, learning starts at birth, and the preparation for learning starts well before birth, right? But at birth, we don't think about the ways in which we should be approaching the cognitive, social, and emotional learning and development of children. And so one thing that I think, again, is an opportunity for us now in the space of dreaming and the way that Sharhonda named, and then I think Octavia Butler was instructive in some time ago, is for us to think about the responsibility of the community. One thing that NBJC is saying to parents, especially parents of Black children, is that this is not the time to sacrifice our babies, especially while adults are playing with them as if they are political pawns. And so our advice is for parents to do what they feel is in the best interest of their children, regardless of the criticism or judgment that will invariably come, especially thinking about how all of this is connected to the fact that there's a presidential election in almost 100 days on Sunday, right? And for them to ensure that their babies are well. A part of what we understand as a pressure point for parents who don't have the luxury of being quarantined at home or working from home during a quarantine or any of those things is the freedom of remembering that learning and development is village work. Right? We are not supposed to be doing this alone. We are not supposed to be doing what Western society has taught us and has moved us further away from African ways of being. And we need to lean into community in ways that allow us to understand, again, this is one about people being healthy and safe so that they can show up in these ways, but we should be having more conversations with each other about how we can alleviate some of the pressures that might exist so that everybody can be well, and in particular, so that Black babies can be well.
Yeah, I think I have two things to add to that. One is yesterday I had a conversation with a former student of mine. I taught U.S. history and government for 5 years, and this former student is now a nurse, and she has an 8-year-old who has been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia. And she right now is thinking about cutting back her hours because her child is not getting what he needs from online school, right? Except for she earns more money than her partner, right? And so her decision to do that will have very real implications on her household income, right? And in addition, she works in a hospital, right? And she works in a hospital in a state that is a hotspot. And she's like, I don't want to leave my team either, right? And I'm a nurse. I signed up to serve people. This is my calling. And she's in tears on the phone with me because she just does not know what to do, right? She is like, I either am going to feel like a bad nurse or a bad mother in this moment. And there are no resources and there is no support for me. And I'm getting emotional thinking about it, right? I've known this young person for 12 years. The other thing that I will say is we have young people who the moment that school went 100% virtual just did not log back on, right? As early as late March, LAUSD had 40,000 students who were not engaging regularly with their online learning platform, right? So they don't know where those students are academically. In some instances, they don't know where those students are physically, right? And as we approach an eviction and foreclosure crisis that we all know is on the very immediate horizon, like we're gonna see students and families move too. So to David's point about this being village work, what happens when you cannot physically stay, right, in your village? What happens when you have to move further away from the support that your family or that your broader village can provide? The other thing is that we're seeing older students opt into the workforce much earlier than they otherwise would, right? Especially our students whose parents are undocumented because their parents cannot work, did not get any of the sort of stimulus money, right? Are not collecting unemployment, et cetera. And so we have young people who are now being forced to go and become breadwinners for their families. And so getting those young people to return to school and making the education that they are going to receive feel real and relevant to the current crisis that their families are confronting is just going to be very hard. And I think as we are also talking to young people who are approaching decisions around college, overwhelmingly, I'm hearing young people say, I don't want to go to college online, right? Because that is not how we have talked about and sold the college experience, right? And so when we think about what credentialing looks like for certain roles and certain career pathways, we have to imagine what that is going to have to look like outside of the traditional higher ed structures, right? Because I don't know if for the next year and a half, young people cannot go to class, they are going to opt into virtual learning, online learning, and paying, right, regular higher education tuition rates. And so what are the sort of credentialing experiences that young people can have outside of formal institutions, as David is talking about, that really not only prepare them for the workforce, but that make them competitive candidates for the kinds of careers that allow them to break cycles of generational poverty in their families and in their communities?
Let me ask you this. As I explained earlier, we at Walmart have made a commitment in delving deep into these four areas, these four pillars: criminal justice, healthcare, finance and education. And under each of these pillars, we have a work stream. We have a work stream that is led by one of our senior executives. And under him, in this case, it is a him, there is a group of individuals who are working to try to figure out what are the roles that we can play? What are the things that we at Walmart can control, both inside of the company as well as outside of the company in the area of education? If I were to bring this group in front of you, what would be some of the things that you would say to them? You all need to consider this because I really believe that Walmart can play a role in it. What are the things that you all think that we should be looking at?
I'll start, and then David will say something that'll spark a new idea. I know it. So I'll start with, open your purse has been, a thing that people like to throw out on Twitter, but that's real, right? Especially when it comes to investing in people who are most proximate to the communities you desire to serve and impact, right? And to be very clear, right, it's about investing in and giving money to Black and Latino folks, right, who are from the communities that have been disproportionately impacted by these crises, right, who know the solutions that their community need, and give them the runway to experiment, to innovate, to fail, to try again, right? Because too often we are not doing that, right? I would also say that you have to expand or broaden the definition of education, right? I think what you heard a lot of me and David talk about today, right, is the fact that education does not exist in a silo. It doesn't exist in a bubble, right? Healthcare, criminal justice reform, immigration reform, all of those things impact the lives of the young people we serve in schools. And so as we are thinking about, and I will just say at EdLock, right, when we think about making investments through our grant making arm, the Boulder Fund, we think about investing in leaders who are working at the intersection of education and broader social justice issues, right? Because we think that that is the only way to sort of get unstuck, right, from some of the issues that have been plaguing public education for a very long time. I think given Walmart's scale and its reach, I think Walmart could actually take a look at its job requirements and qualifications and say, what do people actually need to be able to do in order to do these jobs, right? And does this job actually require a BA? Or are we going to say a BA or, right, a set of other experiences and credentials that prepare someone to take on these jobs. I think Walmart's signaling to the broader sort of private sector, or the broader business and retail sector, right? Like that there are ways to hire people who can be good at these jobs without them having gone through the traditional credentialing or certification experiences could be a game changer. And I think on the philanthropic side, right, investing in education institutions that are providing those kinds of non-traditional credentialing experiences and exposure to people, right? I think a lot about the importance of internal to organizations, what we call sponsorship, right? A lot of folks talk about it as mentorship, right? But is Walmart encouraging its senior executives to mentor across lines of difference, right? Because often what impacts our ability to get jobs, to be successful in jobs, is having an internal champion. And it means that someone has to see in me the promise, right? And often if I look up a ladder, there are not very many queer Black women in senior leadership roles, right? And so it might often mean that someone who does not share my background, someone who does not share my experience, someone who is not of my culture will have to invest in me. And so I think internally creating those kinds of incentives, right, is gonna help change the face of the company. And I would push on that, right? I know there's probably a lot of stuff that David wants to add, but those are my kind of starting points.
Yeah, I love that. And you talking about sparking ideas, I had to grab my iPad because you got me, the list is running. So 3 things came to mind, Tony, and I'm gonna parse this out. You're gonna have to give me a little bit of time to work through this. So 1, there are 3 things that Walmart can and should do right now that would help in a tremendous way. 1 is, with regard to Sharhonda's point about applications, remove everything that is an unnecessary barrier of entry. Mm-hmm. I want anybody at Walmart to tell me why you are asking for gender. Mm-hmm. I want anybody to tell me why. I want us all to be clear about the ways in which asking for someone's physical address, unless you are asking because you're going to mail them a check, is a barrier to entry. And I want us to be especially aware of how problematic things like that are, that become innocuous in companies like Walmart when the current occupant of the Oval Office is denying trans people access to public accommodations, including housing, right? And so the first thing, again, is that reviewing the processes by which Walmart purports to care about, engage with, and provide opportunities to individuals from communities that are most likely to be marginalized is the first step in this process. The second is, and I want to step back and applaud Walmart for all that it has done. I acknowledge that in corporate America, corporate society generally, corporations don't have to do anything, especially acknowledging the tax benefits that have been written in the law by a lot of privileged white men. And so I want to applaud Walmart for that which it has done, and want to be clear that I'm thankful both to you, Tony, and Walmart, and you, Sharhonda and Edlock, for the support of NBJC and our ability to do this work, right? That is important. And it should not be the case that this work, as important as it is relegated to an ad hoc committee. Mm-hmm. I would love for companies that purport to value this to make it a part of their core business operation. And not to efforts. Period, right? And to get away from thinking that the way to solve the problem is to create an ERG group that is not resourced, that requires people to do more labor that they are not paid for, and in ways that never really connect back to the core business model, proposition, or culture in the first place. And so troubling that by doing a bit more is the second step. And again, I hope people, before they hear the criticism, hear the compassion and acknowledging that I appreciate that which has been done. The third thing for me is that when you think about those 4 pillars, healthcare, financial empowerment or the economy, education, and what I call the prison industrial complex, there are things that you all can do, that Walmart can do with education and the learning and development, the holistic cognitive, social, and emotional learning and development of our babies at their center, right? And I want to work through them. One is with regard to healthcare, it's to get in the way of this administration's attempt to prevent healthcare from being accessible to everybody. There are ways in which Walmart, as a provider of healthcare services, can help to fill those gaps, in particular for the communities and individuals that this administration is hell-bent on ensuring don't have access to anything, let alone the ability to participate as citizens in our economy. And so that's first and foremost. And we could talk more about COVID, but I also want to acknowledge that Black folks generally, Black queer folks, Black aging and elderly folks, any intersectional folk, Black folks with disability are more likely to need critical healthcare services and be disproportionately exposed to critical healthcare challenges that y'all can address in a number of ways. The second, when we think about the prison industrial complex, I mentioned one, which is, again, banning the box. I don't know why y'all have that question. I know why. I don't know why corporations that purport to care about Black lives or equity continue to have that question on their application. Again, unless we're talking about a particular high risk, high security job that I can't imagine exists in Walmart in this moment, happy to learn more about this. I don't know why you need to ask the question. And so removing the question on the front end is one way to do it. And then supporting policies that remove police officers and school resource officers and individuals like this white supremacist judge who has a child who is 15 years old locked up during COVID rather than being with her family in positions of power is the second way to do that. Again, thinking about connections between these two institutions that we often talk about as mutually exclusive when they're actually heavily dependent upon one another. Financial literacy is the term that we used to use. I don't know what's in vogue now, financial empowerment. But again, to Sharhonda's point about mentorship, there are ways both big and small that Walmart as a global employer can help people understand the importance of finances. Mm-hmm. And I'm not just talking about the rudimentary ways in which we've done it or are teaching kids to read the stock market in ways that they never actually do, but I'm talking about equipping young people with the skills they need in order to participate in our global financial economy. Right. And then the last one, again, with regard to learning and development, is to acknowledge that learning happens in all different types of spaces. And especially as we think about the opportunity that COVID is preventing in this back to school season, Walmart has, I'm sure, all kinds of resources. Tony, we talked about sourcing mattresses. I would love for Walmart to think about partnership with the kinds of school leaders and system leaders that Sharhonda mentioned, people who have native relationships with communities, people who have relationships with communities before they needed to have them, to identify what gaps exist and then to fill them. The last thing I'll say in this space is really a story. I just want to lift up my brother, Leslie Bernard Joseph. He runs, he's a mutual friend of ours, EdLock member as well, runs Coney Island Prep, a system of schools in New York. And what Leslie did at the beginning of the crisis, to me, reveals the importance of investing in people that have relationships in our community. Mm-hmm. Leslie did a survey of his school, the families and their needs, and understood that the financial constraints and pressures that families were facing were first and foremost, right? It goes back to your question, Tony, about having to make decisions about schools through that lens. And they raised money. They raised money and did something that is disruptive because the way that they gave out money is not in the way in which folks traditionally do it, which is often to invite additional shame. And so they made a list of need where they prioritized the families that had the greatest financial need, and they called and offered them the money. They didn't invite them to fill out an application. They didn't invite them to think about what a letter on the back end would look like. I'm thinking about the grant reports that y'all often ask us to do. They weren't bound to do something in some unreasonable amount of time with the money to demonstrate that it was going to a good cause. They were invited to take the money and offer the ability to refuse it. And most of the families took the money, and those that didn't gave it back. And they had so much success in acknowledging the needs of families in the community that the community replenished the funds that they had been invested in order to do that work. The second thing they did very much related to this was acknowledge food insecurities. And so they worked with companies that partnered, that understood that they might not make the profit that they're used to making in this moment, but that's showing up and doing good trouble. And the legacy of my brother, our brother, Congressman John Lewis, is important. And so they adjusted and they actually partnered with a food truck and looked at their catchment area and had the truck do 3 stops in the community to provide food to the community. And again, this is based on, the thing I want everybody to hear me say on the Walmart side is that a lot of this is based on trust. What they said is that if you come to us and tell us how many school-age kids you have, and we'll give you the meal for them, because some of it is supplemented by the government, right? And it is important for their tracking. They also said, tell us how many people in your household need to eat that are not school-age children, because we're gonna give you the food. Right. And so again, what I'm highlighting is that too often grants are administered to communities that mirror the things that make the grantee feel good rather than acknowledging the needs of the community. And I haven't even mentioned the cognitive, social, emotional learning and development of those kids, in part because that couldn't even be attended to until the economic concerns and the health insecurities were attended to. I could also spend time talking about housing insecurities, but I think you get the point here. There are so many leaders like Leslie Bernard Joseph, who are in communities throughout this country, who don't get invited to share platforms like this, who don't have the benefit of corporate sponsorship, who need Walmart to do more and better.
I want to add one other thing about Leslie Bernard Joseph and the Coney Island Prep team is that they then bundled all of the resources and made it public, right? So everything they did around meeting the needs of families, everything they are doing and planning for returning to school is open source. They have built an external website, right? So that folks can go and say like, actually, you've had real success there. We can learn from you. Like, let me borrow from you what was successful in your community. And I think that that just speaks to the kind of leadership that we, to David's point, want to be supporting all across the country.
Such good stuff. I absolutely love it. And I love the pieces of advice. And not that I'm trying to do a Walmart commercial here. David, know that we've taken very seriously those things that you've mentioned. So, when I mentioned the work stream, they're just the group that are doing exactly what you're saying that we're supposed to do. How are they going to make sure that this stuff streams and becomes part of our value structure and behavior? So this group is not just the group that's just going to do it all. They're the ones that are kind of driving it to make sure that it gets driven throughout all forms of the company. When it comes to,
I love that, and I imagine that those people show up like you. And my hope is that they're being compensated for that additional, incredibly important work.
Let's hope so too. No, I'm just kidding. Yes, they are. They are. It's really significant work. On the criminal justice side, you're absolutely right. We took off the crime-related questions off our applications back in 2010. In fact, we were the first corporation to do that because, to your point, we figured out that it harmed the process more than it helped, right? Because so often, it doesn't create the right kind of a playing field for people, and we realized that thanks to a lot of great partners. The NAACP helped us helped us in the conversation and seeing all of that, and asked us, would you consider taking it off? So we took it off. So you are spot on there. I love all of this. I absolutely love all of this. And I've kept you all long enough, so I have one more question.
Yeah.
What advice do you give us as individuals? What action steps should we be taking? Whether you're talking corporations and individual teachers, parents, what should we be doing as we move forward to try to eliminate inequity in education?
David, I'm gonna let you kick that off.
Yeah. In part because I'm a troubler, Tony. That's an impossible question. In part because there's power and precision. And what I know, not having children, but loving them, is that the things that one might say or do as a parent could be very different than they would do as an education practitioner or as a leader in a corporate space. And so I want to honor that many of us lead intersectional lives. I'm loath in this moment to name Kanye West because of all of the help that he needs and the distraction that he's providing in the world. But he a long time ago highlighted that so many of us are contradictions. Mm-hmm. And so I will answer specific to parents and then move from there. I want parents to do two things. One is to ensure that their babies are well. Again, hear me when I say do what is in the best interest of your child, their cognitive, social, and emotional learning and well-being, especially as it relates to going back to school, whatever that means, in whatever state, locality, and space y'all are in. Do what is in their best interest. And if you prioritize their mental health, their physical well-being above and beyond their ability to do math or speak in jargon or do any of the tasks that we expect for them to do in traditional public schools, do that. We can supplement and fill that stuff in on the back end, but if they're not well, they cannot be. Very much related to that, the second thing is that young people, students, children cannot believe the things we say if they're looking at the things that we do and they're in contradiction or in conflict with one another. And so I'm begging adults, and whatever that means, to model wellness. And I know that Black people, Black queer people, Black women, people with disabilities, those of us who often sacrifice to do this work literally are least likely to know how to do that.
Mhm.
And so I'm not saying it because I think that it's easy. In fact, I know it's the opposite, as somebody who is struggling through it and still does this work. And I'm begging us all to do that. And so I hope that that's helpful both for people who are parents and then for adults more generally. I think the last thing that I would say to corporations, there are three things. One is do no harm. So often people in positions of privilege, whether that's because they have access to whiteness or cisness or heteronormativity or socioeconomic status, are rarely held accountable for the things that inhibit us from being the beloved community that John Lewis talked about. And a way that that's showing up is that corporations are tripping over themselves to put up banners that say that they stand with Black lives or they're in solidarity with this influencer, or to do the thing that in theory sends the biggest signal without appreciating that going deep and investing in meaningful ways that are measurable over time is how we actually all get free. And so what I want is for corporations and individuals that are trying to make themselves feel better and want to get away from the discomfort that comes with all of what we're talking about, is to not do that. It's to sit in the discomfort, to acknowledge that we've been here for a long time and there have been members of our community that have been in the messier parts of this than other parts of the community, and that that's necessary for healing.
This is where you're like, if this was church, I'd be like, pass the basket, right? Because I'm ready to tithe. The one thing that I would add here is I really want people as individuals to return to themselves in this moment, right? I think that so many of us are so busy right now, and part of the busyness is distracting us from the stuff that's really hard about life right now, right? And I took some time, I unplugged, right? And I was like, what do I actually believe about the world, my values, my place in it, right? How do I want to be showing up in relationships, both professional and personal relationships? Who are the thinkers and the theorists and the researchers that have shaped how I see the world? What have they said? What lessons can I learn? Because we have, to David's point, we have been here before, right? And so as I think about what it means to be in this moment and to try and chart a path forward with the people with whom I'm in community, I have to be clear on who I am and my values and how I want to show up in that community, right? And I just see so many people right now for a host of reasons, and it is hard to sit still, especially those of us, right, who have made entire careers out of being out there and being productive, right? It is hard to sit still and sit with yourself in this moment, but that's what I've been asking people as humans to do, right? Who are you? Who do you want to be in this moment? How do you see the world? And what do you want to contribute? And I think, to sort of close the loop on where I started, I think that too often schools don't provide young people the space to explore that either. And I think what we have learned is that this emphasis, this focus on productivity, right, is literally going to kill us. And it is going to mean sacrificing ourselves, our friends, and our family, and our neighbors, right? If we don't return to who we are and who we are meant to be in community with one another.
Yeah,
Wow.
if I could add one more thing,
Yeah.
to Sharhonda made me think about this in terms of acknowledging where I am in all of this. And this is also to acknowledge that I'm getting older. I would love to do this with younger people.
Yeah.
Our babies are and have been leading and innovating in ways that we don't have the language to describe.
Yeah.
And as you know, I think that the most meaningful way for us to do things in the space of education is to ensure that we center young people in that process. So I will offer up NBJC's Youth and Young Adult Advisory Council, or our Thriving campaign, which is funded actually in part by both Walmart and Leaders of Color, as a space for us to engage in a version of this conversation with young people who are more directly affected by the decisions that adults make.
Have we been to the barbershop or what, y'all?
You know,
I'm not sure if it was the barbershop. I'm not sure if it's the barbershop or the church, but it worked.
For some, they're the same place.
Yes.
Hey,
Listen.
say so.
Listen.
I love it. This has been such an awesome conversation, and I wish we could continue because I want more. because there's, I think, so much more to even discuss on this. And but I cannot thank you enough for giving up your time and sharing your thoughts with us. I hope that those who have the opportunity to view this episode really get something from it. I know I have. You've given me a lot to think about as we move forward in this racial equity work. And I'm just hoping that your dreams, as you radically dream the way that you are dreaming, that you will get to see those dreams come true. And so with that, I say goodbye and thank you, Sharhonda. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. And we will catch you the next time at Real Talk at the Barbershop, the virtual edition.